When 200 Apache warriors surrounded Jeremiah, Iron McCready's ranch on that blood-red October morning in 1887, they didn't come for cattle or horses. They came for something far more valuable than livestock, something that couldn't be replaced or bought back with gold. They came for justice. And Iron McCready, once the most feared gunslinger in all of Arizona territory, was about to learn that some debts can only be paid in blood. But this story doesn't start with war drums and war paint. It starts 3 months earlier, in the dusty saloon of Tombstone, where Iron McCready was drowning his sorrows in rot-gut whiskey and bitter memories. At 45, Iron had seen more death than most men see in 3 lifetimes. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless gunfights. His steel-gray eyes held the haunted look of a man who'd killed too many times to count, and his reputation as the fastest draw in the Southwest preceded him wherever he rode. Iron wasn't born mean. Growing up on a small farm outside Dallas, Jeremiah McCready had been a gentle boy who preferred reading books to breaking horses. But the Civil War changed everything. He'd enlisted at 17, fought for the Confederacy at Gettysburg and Bull Run, and came home to find his family's farm burned to ash and his parents murdered by Union raiders. That's when gentle Jeremiah died and Iron McCready was born, forged in grief and tempered by an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. For 20 years, Iron had made his living with his guns. He'd worked as a bounty hunter, a hired gun, and occasionally as a lawman when the money was right. He'd cleaned out rustlers from Colorado to California, faced down entire gangs single-handed, and never once backed down from fight. But success in the gunfighting business comes with a price, and Iron had paid in full. He had no family, no friends, and no home except whatever bunk he could rent for the night. That's what brought him to Tombstone in July of 1887. Word had reached him about a gang of cattle rustlers led by a half-breed named Carlos Mendez who'd been hitting ranches along the Mexican border. The territorial governor had put a $1,000 bounty on Mendez's head, dead or alive, and Iron needed the money. His arthritis was getting worse, his draw was a fraction slower than it used to be, and he could feel Father Time creeping up on him like a stalking cougar. The bartender at the Oriental Saloon was a nervous man named Pete who'd heard all the stories about Iron McCready's reputation. As Iron sat alone at the bar, methodically working through his 3rd bottle of whiskey, Pete tried to make conversation. "Heard you're going after the Mendez gang," Pete said, polishing a glass with shaking hands. "That's dangerous work, even for a man of your reputation." Iron looked up from his drink, and Pete immediately regretted speaking. Those gray eyes were like looking into a winter storm, cold and merciless. "Been doing dangerous work since before you were born, boy," Iron said quietly. Carlos Mendez is just another name on a long list of men who need killing. What Iron didn't know was that Carlos Mendez wasn't just another rustler. Mendez was the adopted son of Chief Red Eagle, leader of the Chiricahua Apache, taken in as a boy after his Mexican parents were killed in a raid. The Apache had raised him as their own, and despite his mixed heritage, he'd earned the respect of the warriors through his courage and wisdom. More importantly, Chief Red Eagle loved Carlos like a blood son, and the Apache Code demanded that any harm to family be answered with overwhelming force. Iron spent 2 weeks tracking the Mendez gang through the unforgiving Arizona desert. The heat was brutal, reaching 115 degrees in the shade, and water was scarce. His horse, a tough Mustang named Devil, was showing signs of exhaustion, but Iron pressed on. The desert was a cruel mistress, stretching endlessly in all directions like a sea of red sand and broken rock. During the day, the sun beat down mercilessly, turning metal too hot to touch and making every breath feel like swallowing fire. At night, the temperature dropped 40 degrees, leaving Iron shivering in his bedroll while coyotes howled in the distance. Iron had learned to read the desert during his years as a bounty hunter. He could spot Apache sign from a mile away, find water where other men saw only barren rock, and track a horse across terrain that would challenge the best cavalry scouts. But even with all his experience, the pursuit of the Mendez gang was testing every skill he'd ever learned. The outlaws were clever, doubling back on their own trail, riding through creek beds to hide their tracks, and splitting up to confuse anyone following them. But Iron was patient, methodical, and utterly relentless. He'd been hunting dangerous men for 2 decades, and he knew that every criminal, no matter how smart, eventually made a mistake. On the 10th day of tracking, Iron found the mistake he'd been waiting for. The gang had camped near a small waterhole, and one of them had carved his initials into a nearby Joshua tree. It was a small thing, the kind of thoughtless act that bored men do without thinking, but it told Iron everything he needed to know. The carving was fresh, maybe 2 days old, which meant the gang was only a day ahead of him now. He'd survived worse conditions during his war years, and the promise of $1,000 kept him moving through the blistering landscape. The gang's hideout was a box canyon about 50 miles southeast of Tucson, hidden among red rock formations that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments. Iron found them on a Tuesday morning, cooking breakfast over a small fire and arguing about their next target. There were 6 of them, including Mendez, all armed and dangerous men who'd rather fight than surrender. Iron could have waited for them to leave the canyon and picked them off one by one from long range. That would have been the smart play, the safe play. But Iron McCready had never been known for taking the safe path. He wanted to look Carlos Mendez in the eye when he killed him. It was a matter of professional pride. He rode devil straight into the canyon with his rifle across his saddle and his twin Colt .45s hanging loose in their holsters. The rustlers saw him coming and scrambled for their weapons, but Iron was already in motion. He put 2 bullets into the first man before the outlaw could clear leather, then rolled off Devil's back as the shooting started in earnest. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes felt like hours. Bullets whined off the canyon walls, ricocheting in all directions like angry hornets. Iron moved like a man possessed, rolling behind rocks and firing with deadly precision that came from years of practice and countless life-or-death situations. His first shot took down a bearded outlaw who was trying to flank him from the left. The man spun around and dropped his rifle, clutching his chest as he fell. The second outlaw, a young Mexican with scared eyes, got off 2 wild shots before Iron put a bullet through his heart. The kid couldn't have been more than 19, probably new to the outlaw life and already paying the ultimate price for his poor choices. A third man tried to use the horses as cover, but Iron had anticipated the move. He put 2 quick shots into the outlaw's legs, dropping him behind a frightened bay mare. When the man tried to crawl away, Iron finished him with a shot to the head. The fourth outlaw was smarter, using the canyon's natural cover to his advantage and laying down steady fire that kept Iron pinned behind a large boulder. For nearly a minute, the 2 men traded shots, with neither able to get a clean shot at the other. Iron was starting to worry about his ammunition when the outlaw made a fatal mistake. He rose up slightly to get a better angle, exposing his shoulder for just a split second. Iron's bullet found its mark, spinning the man around and sending him tumbling down a small slope. The 5th man surrendered when he realized he was alone with Carlos Mendez against the most feared gunfighter in the Southwest. He threw down his weapons and raised his hands, begging for mercy in rapid Spanish. Iron might have let him live, but Carlos Mendez had other ideas. While Iron was focused on the surrendering outlaw, Mendez put a bullet in the man's back, eliminating a potential witness. His years of experience showed as he picked his shots carefully, making every bullet count. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead in the red dirt. Only Carlos Mendez remained, wounded in the shoulder, but still alive. Iron stood over him, his smoking Colts pointed at the half-breed's head. "Any last words?" Iron asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Carlos looked up at him with defiant eyes. "You don't know what you're doing, gringo. My father will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." Iron laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Your father? Boy, your father's probably some Mexican peon who couldn't protect his family from raiders. Dead men don't hunt nobody. My father is Chief Red Eagle of the Chiricahua Apache," Carlos said quietly. "And he has 200 warriors who will paint this desert with your blood." For the first time in 20 years, Iron McCready felt a chill of real fear. The Apache were different from other enemies he'd faced. They didn't fight for money or territory or glory. They fought for family, for honor, for reasons that went deeper than any white man could understand. And Chief Red Eagle's reputation was known throughout the Southwest. He'd never lost a battle against the U.S. cavalry, never broken a promise, and never forgotten an enemy. But Iron had come too far to back down now. The bounty was $1,000, more money than he'd seen in months. He needed that money to buy a small spread somewhere and retire from the gunfighting business before his slowing reflexes got him killed. "Should have thought about that before you started stealing cattle," Iron said, and pulled the trigger. Iron collected the bounty money in Tucson 3 days later, but the satisfaction he'd expected never came. The territorial governor's office was housed in a dusty adobe building that reeked of stale tobacco and bureaucratic indifference. The clerk who counted out his $1,000 was a nervous little man with ink-stained fingers who kept glancing at Iron's guns as if they might go off by themselves. "That's quite a reputation you've built for yourself, McCready," the clerk said as he handed over the money. "Word is you took down the whole Mendez gang single-handed." Iron just nodded and stuffed the bills into his shirt pocket. He learned long ago that talking about his gunfights only led to exaggeration and eventually to some young hotshot looking to make a name for himself by outdrawing the famous Iron McCready. As he sat in his hotel room that night counting the bills, he couldn't shake Carlos Mendez's final words. The money felt heavier than it should have, each bill seeming to carry the weight of a young man's dying curse. Iron had killed dozens of men over the years, but something about this particular death felt different. Maybe it was the way Carlos had spoken about his father with such obvious love and respect. Maybe it was the defiant dignity the young man had shown, even with a gun pointed at his head. The Apache had a saying, "Blood calls to blood across any distance." Iron had heard it from an old cavalry scout years ago, and he dismissed it as primitive superstition. But now, sitting alone in a shabby hotel room with blood money in his hands, the words seemed to carry an ominous weight. Had a saying, "Blood calls to blood across any distance." Iron had spilled Apache blood, even if it was mixed with Mexican, and that meant the debt would have to be paid. For 2 months, nothing happened. Iron used part of his bounty money to buy a small ranch about 30 miles north of Phoenix, a spread with good water and decent grazing land. The property had belonged to a German immigrant who'd given up on ranching after losing half his cattle to rustlers the previous winter. Iron got it for a good price, along with a modest cabin, a barn that needed repairs, and about 50 head of cattle that had somehow survived both the rustlers and the harsh Arizona winter. He hired 2 Mexican hands to help with the cattle, brothers named Miguel and Roberto, who knew horses and could work cattle better than most men twice their age. They asked no questions about Iron's past and seemed content to work for fair wages and regular meals. Iron appreciated their quiet competence and the fact that they didn't flinch when they saw his guns. For the first time in decades, Iron tried to imagine a life without violence. He spent his mornings mending fences and checking water holes, his afternoons working cattle, and his evenings sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the desert mountains. It was peaceful work, honest work, and there were moments when Iron almost believed he could make it last. But peace was something that had always eluded Iron McCready, and deep in his heart, he knew it wasn't about to find him now. The desert had a way of keeping secrets, but it also had a way of giving them up when the time was right. The first sign of trouble came from his neighbor, a German immigrant named Otto Zimmerman, who ran sheep on the adjacent property. Otto rode over one morning in late September, his face pale with worry. "Herr McCready," he said in his thick accent, "I think we have big trouble coming. My shepherds, they see Apache sign all around these hills. War paint and war ponies. They say maybe 200 warriors, all painted for battle." Iron felt his stomach drop. 200 warriors was more than twice the number that had wiped out Custer at Little Bighorn. Against that many Apache, even the U.S. cavalry would think twice about engaging. "You sure about those numbers, Otto?" "My boys, they know Apache sign like you know gunpowder. They say this is biggest war party they ever see in these parts. And Herr McCready," Otto paused, clearly struggling with something. "They say the warriors, they ask questions about you. About the man who killed Carlos Mendez." Iron spent the next week preparing for what he knew was coming. He cleaned and loaded every weapon he owned, including an old Sharps rifle that could drop a man at 800 yards and a sawed-off shotgun that was devastating at close range. He laid in supplies of ammunition and food, enough to withstand a siege if necessary. He also spent time studying the terrain around his ranch, looking for defensive positions and escape routes. The hardest decision was sending his Mexican hands away. Miguel and Roberto had been good workers and decent men, and Iron couldn't bear the thought of them dying for his past mistakes. He called them into the cabin on a Tuesday morning and explained the situation as best he could without going into all the bloody details. "There's trouble coming," he told them. "Apache trouble. Men who have a grudge against me for something I did before I came here. I'm giving you each a month's pay and a good horse. I want you to ride south and don't look back." Miguel, the older of the two brothers, studied Iron's face carefully. "Senor, we are not afraid of Apaches. We have fought them before." "Not like this," Iron said quietly. "These aren't raiders looking for horses. These are warriors coming for blood. My blood. And there's going to be too many of them for 3 men to handle." Roberto crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. "How many, senor?" "Maybe 200. Both men went pale. 200 Apache warriors was an army, enough to wipe out a cavalry regiment if they caught them in the wrong place at the wrong time. Iron also wrote a letter to his sister back in Texas, the first contact he'd had with his family in over 15 years. The letter was short and to the point, explaining that he probably wouldn't live to see another winter and asking her to forgive him for the life he'd chosen. He also included half of his remaining money, hoping it would help her raise her children in a world that was less violent than the one he'd known. The Apache came at dawn on October 15th, 1887. Iron was drinking coffee on his front porch when he saw them cresting the ridge that surrounded his small valley. They came in perfect formation, a line of warriors that stretched across the entire horizon. War paint gleamed in the early morning light. Feathers fluttered from their horses' manes, and every man carried weapons that had been blessed by the tribal medicine man. At the center of the formation rode Chief Red Eagle himself, a man whose presence could be felt even at a distance. He was smaller than Iron had expected, probably no taller than 5'8", but he carried himself with the dignity of a king. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that pranced and snorted as if it could sense the importance of the moment. The chief wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long black hair was streaked with silver that caught the morning light. Red Eagle's face was a study in controlled grief and barely contained rage. This wasn't a man who had come here for negotiation or compromise. This was a father who had lost his son, a leader whose family had been violated, a warrior whose honor demanded satisfaction. Iron could see all of this in the chief's dark eyes, and he knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The other warriors were younger, most of them in their 20s and 30s, painted for war and armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and modern firearms. Iron could see rifles and pistols alongside war lances and tomahawks. These men had learned to fight both the old way and the new way, making them twice as dangerous as any enemy Iron had ever faced. Iron set down his coffee cup and walked to the center of his yard. He was dressed in his best clothes, a black suit that he'd worn to more funerals than he cared to remember. His twin Colts hung at his sides, and a Winchester rifle rested in the crook of his arm. If he was going to die today, he was going to die like a man. Chief Red Eagle raised his hand, and the entire war party stopped moving. The silence that followed was deafening. No bird songs, no wind, no sound except the distant snorting of horses and the creaking of leather. The chief dismounted and walked forward alone, stopping about 20 feet from Iron. "You are the one called Iron McCready," the chief said in perfect English. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was steel beneath the words. "I am," Iron replied. "And I reckon you're Chief Red Eagle." "I am. You killed my son." Iron nodded. "Carlos Mendez had a bounty on his head for cattle rustling. I was just doing my job." "Your job," Red Eagle repeated, and for the first time, emotion flickered across his weathered face. Your job was to murder a young man who was trying to feed his people in a land that was once ours but is now ruled by your laws. Iron felt something shift inside him. He'd spent 20 years convincing himself that his targets were just names on wanted posters, obstacles to be removed for money. But looking into Red Eagle's eyes, he saw the same grief he'd felt when he found his parents' bodies all those years ago. "I didn't know he was your son," Iron said quietly. "Would it have mattered?" Red Eagle asked. Iron thought about the question for a long moment. Would it have mattered? Would he have walked away from $1,000 bounty just because his target had family who loved him? The honest answer was probably not, and that realization hit him like a physical blow. "No," Iron said finally. "Probably not. I needed the money." Red Eagle nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "My son spoke of you before he died. He said you were a man without honor, without family, without love. He said you were already dead inside, and that killing your body would be a mercy." The words stung because they were true. Iron had indeed been dead inside for 20 years, going through the motions of living without ever truly being alive. "Your son was a smart man," Iron said. "He was. And now he is gone, and the hole in my heart will never heal. But you," Red Eagle studied Iron's face carefully. "You have the same emptiness in your eyes that my son described. You have been carrying the weight of death for so long that you have forgotten what it means to live." Behind Red Eagle, the Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, waiting for their chief's signal. Iron could see the tension in their postures, the way their hands rested near their weapons. They were like coiled springs, ready to explode into violence at a moment's notice. "I came here to kill you," Red Eagle continued, "to paint the desert with your blood and leave your body for the buzzards. It would be justice under Apache law. Blood for blood, life for life." "I understand," Iron said, "and I won't run. I'm tired of running from ghosts." Red Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes never leaving Iron's face. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone present, including his own warriors. "But killing you would not bring back my son. It would only add another ghost to the ones that already haunt this land." Behind the chief, several warriors began murmuring among themselves. This was not what they had come here to do. They had painted themselves for war, blessed their weapons for battle, and ridden for days to reach this place. The idea of leaving without spilling blood was almost incomprehensible. A young warrior named Broken Lance rode forward, his face twisted with anger and paint that made him look like death incarnate. He was maybe 25 years old, with the lean build of a man who had grown up in the saddle and the scars of someone who had already proven himself in battle. His war lance was decorated with eagle feathers and painted symbols that told the story of his victories over enemies. Broken Lance spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice rising with each word, and Iron could see that other warriors were nodding in agreement. This was clearly a man who commanded respect among his peers, someone whose opinions carried weight in tribal councils. The exchange between him and Red Eagle continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding their voices to the debate. Iron watched the discussion with growing tension, knowing that his life hung in the balance of words he couldn't understand. He could see the passion in Broken Lance's gestures, the way other young warriors leaned forward in their saddles when he spoke. This was a man arguing for blood, for the old ways, for Apache justice that had been practiced for generations. "What are they saying?" Iron asked. Red Eagle turned back to him. "They're saying that I have grown weak in my old age, that the death of my son has clouded my judgment. They believe that Apache honor demands your death, and that my hesitation dishonors Carlos's memory." Iron looked at the faces of the warriors around him. Young men, most of them, burning with righteous anger and a desire for vengeance. He recognized the look because he'd worn it himself for most of his adult life. "Maybe they're right," Iron said. "Maybe some debts can only be paid in blood." "Perhaps," Red Eagle said, "but I have learned something in my 63 years on this earth. Vengeance is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. It consumes the one who seeks it more than the one who deserves it." Broken Lance dismounted and strode forward, his war lance gleaming in the morning sun. He planted himself between Iron and Red Eagle, speaking with passionate intensity. Even without understanding the words, Iron could see that the young warrior was issuing some kind of challenge to his chief's authority. Red Eagle's response was quiet but firm. He placed his hand on Broken Lance's shoulder and spoke for nearly 5 minutes, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. As he talked, Iron watched the young warrior's expression slowly change from anger to confusion to something that might have been understanding. When Red Eagle finished speaking, Broken Lance looked at Iron with new eyes. The hatred was still there, but it was tempered now by something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. The young warrior asked a single question, and Red Eagle translated. He wants to know if you have ever lost someone you loved to violence. Iron thought about his parents, about the burned farm and the unmarked graves, about the empty years that followed, the countless faces of men he'd killed, the long nights spent alone with nothing but whiskey and regret for company. Yes, he said simply, I have. Red Eagle translated, and Broken Lance asked another question. He wants to know if killing the men responsible brought your loved ones back. No, Iron said, his voice barely above a whisper. It didn't bring them back. It just made me emptier inside. This translation caused a stir among the warriors. Several of them began talking at once, their voices creating a low rumble that rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Red Eagle raised his hand for silence, then turned back to Iron. My warriors are young, the chief said. They see the world in simple terms. Bad men do bad things, so bad men must die. But you and I, we are old enough to understand that the world is not so simple. We are old enough to know that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is choose not to fight. Iron felt something breaking apart inside his chest, some hard shell that had protected his heart for 20 years. So what happens now? He asked. Red Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for answers in the distant mountains. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Now you have a choice. You can die today, here in this valley, and become just another ghost haunting this desert. Or you can live and try to become something more than the sum of the men you have killed. What do you mean? I mean that Carlos's death will have meaning only if something good comes from it. If his sacrifice teaches other men to choose life over death, hope over vengeance, then perhaps the hole in my heart will begin to heal. Behind Red Eagle, the warriors were growing restless. This was not the outcome they had expected, and several of them were clearly unhappy with their chief's decision. But Red Eagle's authority was absolute, and no one would openly challenge him. Iron looked around at the faces surrounding him. 200 Apache warriors, all painted for war, all ready to die for their chief's honor. And here was that same chief, offering him something that Iron had never thought possible: redemption. What would you have me do? Iron asked. Red Eagle smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Live, he said simply. Live, and remember that every man you choose not to kill is a victory over the darkness that has consumed your soul. Live, and teach other men that there is another way. The old chief walked back to his horse and mounted in one fluid motion. He raised his hand again, and the entire war party began to turn their horses around. But before they could leave, Iron called out. Chief Red Eagle, the Apache leader, turned back to him. I'm sorry, Iron said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside his chest. I'm sorry about your son. I'm sorry about all of it. Red Eagle nodded slowly. I know you are, and perhaps that is enough. As the Apache war party disappeared over the ridge, Iron McCready sank to his knees in the red dirt of his yard. For the first time in 20 years, he wept. He wept for Carlos Mendez, for his own parents, for all the men he'd killed, and all the lives he'd destroyed. But mostly, he wept because he was finally free. Iron McCready lived for another 18 years after that October morning. He never drew his guns in anger again, never took another bounty, never killed another man. Instead, he became known throughout Arizona territory as a man who could settle disputes without violence, who could talk angry young men out of making the same mistakes he had made. He married a widow named Martha Henderson in 1891, and together they raised her 3 children as their own. He taught them to read and write, to treat all people with respect regardless of their race or background, and to understand that true courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified. When Iron died peacefully in his sleep in 1905, his funeral was attended by people from every walk of life. Cowboys and farmers, Mexican laborers and Apache traders, former outlaws and respected businessmen. Chief Red Eagle, now an old man himself, rode 200 miles to pay his respect to the gunfighter who had chosen life over death. At the graveside, Red Eagle spoke the traditional Apache prayer for the dead. But he also added something of his own. This man learned that the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies, but in turning them into friends. May his spirit find the peace in death that he discovered in life. Iron McCready's story became legend in the Southwest, passed down through generations as proof that no man is too far gone for redemption. But perhaps the most important part of the story isn't about Iron at all. It's about Chief Red Eagle, a man who had every right to seek vengeance, but chose mercy instead. In choosing to spare Iron's life, the old chief proved that true strength lies not in the ability to take life, but in the wisdom to preserve it. The ranch where Iron McCready faced down 200 Apache warriors still stands today, though it's been expanded and modernized over the years. Local historians have placed a marker there, commemorating the day when two men chose understanding over violence and changed the course of history in their small corner of the world. And sometimes, on quiet October mornings when the desert wind carries the scent of sage and distant rain, visitors to the ranch claim they can still feel the presence of those who gathered there over a century ago, not as ghosts seeking vengeance, but as spirits celebrating the moment when mercy triumphed over hatred and proved that it's never too late for a man to change his stars.